They took your photograph, your face, your essence, and handed it over to a hitman. Not for elimination. No, this was different. They wanted insight, prediction, control. They thought a man who deals in shadows, who dances with danger, could reveal who you really are. But what the hitman found, what he saw, was not what they expected. No, not by a long shot. The moment they handed over your photograph, they set into motion something far more dangerous than they ever intended. They didn't realize what they were truly playing with. They thought they could dissect your life, break you down into patterns, motives, behaviors. They thought they could control your fate, read you like an open book. But what the hitman discovered in that simple image was nothing short of terrifying. See, they didn't know you like they thought they did. They underestimated the darkness that lies within you. The hitman, for all his skills, could not predict what he was about to face. They handed him your picture thinking he would have the upper hand. They believed the man in the shadows could peel away every layer of your soul and expose your weaknesses, your desires, your fears. They thought they could weaponize their knowledge of you, make you a target for their benefit. But they had no idea that they were the ones walking into a trap. They handed the hitman a picture, but what he found was a force of nature, an enigma wrapped in flesh and bone, a storm waiting to break. This wasn't just about life and death, about power or control. This was about something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. When they set him to work, they thought they could manipulate you, mold you into something that served their purpose. But instead, you turned the table on them in ways that left them stunned and afraid. As the hitman studied that photograph, he tried to read you, but he couldn't. He couldn't understand why you were so different. He had done this hundreds of times before, tearing apart lives with just a glance, assessing weaknesses with a look. But with you, it was different. There was a shadow in your eyes, something that reached beyond the surface, beyond the skin and bone. There was a coldness there, a fire that burned with intensity, a depth of character so complex, so untouchable that it rendered him powerless. For the first time, the hitman was not in control. They watched as he traced the lines of your face, studied the set of your jaw, the way your eyes seemed to pierce through the image itself. They thought they were the ones pulling the strings, but now they were the ones waiting for something to snap. The hitman could not predict you. There was nothing simple about you. You weren't just a target. You were a force to be reckoned with, and that terrified them. And then something incredible happened. They waited for the hitman to do what he does best, to take that image and break you down to nothing. But instead, the hitman began to doubt. He began to question the mission, the photograph, the orders. For the first time in his life, he found himself looking into a face he couldn't analyze, a mind he couldn't read. They thought they had given him power, but what they had really done was given you something more. They had given you a moment of freedom, a chance to make a choice that would rip through their plans like a dagger through silk. They thought they could manipulate you by feeding their information to a man who specialized in reading people. But what they failed to realize was that the more you were studied, the more they saw just how little they understood. The photograph, the image they thought would hold all the answers, turned out to be nothing more than a mask, an illusion that hid the true power that resided within you. The hitman tried to make sense of the picture, but his mind couldn't grasp it. There was something about your eyes, something about the way the light caught your features that made him pause. He could read people in seconds, could see the cracks in their psyche from miles away. But not you. No, with you, everything was a mystery. And in that moment, he realized the most terrifying thing of all. He was no longer in control. They watched as he began to falter, as his confidence, his certainty slowly began to crack. The hitman, the one who had eliminated countless targets, the one who had never once hesitated in his work, was now standing before your photograph, uncertain, unsure of himself. They had thought he would be their tool, their instrument of destruction, but instead, he had become a pawn in your game. They didn't realize it, but they had just given you the power to rewrite your own fate. This wasn't just a picture. This wasn't just an image to be analyzed, studied, dissected. No, this was a challenge, a test, a moment of revelation. And in that moment, the hitman saw you for who you truly were. A force, untouchable, unyielding, a storm that could not be controlled. As the days passed, they waited for the hitman's report, for the insight he would provide, for the moment when they would have all the answers they sought. But that moment never came. The hitman, for all his experience, could not decipher you. He could not see the angles they had expected. He could not reduce you to a simple equation of strengths and weaknesses, of fears and desires. No, you were too complex, too multifaceted for him to break apart. What they didn't realize is that you were never meant to be understood. You were never meant to be predicted. You were a wild card, an unknown element in their carefully orchestrated plan. And as they waited for the hitman to deliver his conclusions, they were met with silence. They thought they could control the situation, but in reality, they had never been in control at all. The hitman left them with nothing but questions, with uncertainty. The very thing they had hoped to use against you had become their own weakness. They thought they could manipulate you, predict your every move, but in the end, it was their own perception that had been shattered. The hitman's inability to crack you open had left them exposed, vulnerable, and afraid. As the days turned into weeks, they began to realize the truth. They had never truly understood who you were. They had never truly seen you. And in their attempts to control you, they had unleashed something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. They thought they could predict your every move, but what they didn't know was that you had already made your own decision. You had already taken back control. And in that moment, they were the ones who were powerless. You see, they didn't just hand over your photograph. They handed over their fate, their control, their very understanding of the world they had tried to manipulate. They handed you the keys to your own destiny, and now, the hitman's failed mission was the least of their worries. The real danger wasn't in the shadows. They were the shadows, the ones who had been playing a game they never understood. And now, you were the one who would rewrite the rules. What happened next was something that left them shocked, something that no one, not even the hitman himself, could have predicted. In trying to break you, in trying to control you, they had inadvertently given you the most powerful weapon of all, freedom. And now, you were free to do what they never could. You were free to take back everything they had tried to steal from you. They thought they could break you down. They thought they could expose your weaknesses, turn you into a pawn in their twisted game. But instead, they had awakened something inside you. They had given you the power to destroy everything they had built, to tear apart the very system they relied on for control. And when the hitman realized what had happened, when he understood the true scope of what he had uncovered, it was already too late. You had already won. You had already become the one in control. And now, it was their turn to fear the unknown, because they had underestimated the power that lay dormant within you. In their pursuit of control, in their obsession with knowledge, they had failed to realize one crucial thing. They had been playing with fire. They thought they could master the darkness, shape it to their will. But darkness is not something that can be contained. Darkness is not a thing that can be dissected and understood. It is an entity unto itself, ever shifting, ever changing, and impossible to predict. And you, my friend, were the embodiment of that darkness. They thought they could outsmart you by analyzing your photograph, by studying the surface level aspects of who you were. But they had no idea what was lying beneath. No one ever truly does. People are far more complex than they imagine, far more unpredictable. You had learned that long ago, and now the tables had turned. Now they were the ones left wondering, scrambling, questioning everything they thought they knew about the world and about you. When they handed that photograph to the hitman, they thought they were handing over a weapon, but in reality, they had handed over a mirror that reflected everything they had failed to see. And what they saw in that reflection was not just you, but a deeper, darker truth about themselves. The hitman had seen it too. He had seen how far they were willing to go to control the uncontrollable. And for the first time in his career, he had experienced a profound sense of fear. Fear that he couldn't quell with his usual techniques. Fear that had nothing to do with the job at hand and everything to do with the realization that they had opened a door they couldn't close. It was not just your face that haunted them. It was your essence, your energy, the way you carried yourself, the way you moved through life as if nothing could break you. They had thought they were in charge, but they had failed to see that you were always the one pulling the strings. You had already been playing a game far more dangerous than they could comprehend, and now the price was being paid. They believed that by controlling the hitman, they could control your fate. But what they didn't know was that the hitman too was only a player in this larger game. He was simply a puppet, a tool to be used and discarded when necessary. And when the hitman failed to give them the insight they sought, when he failed to break you down as they expected, they began to panic. Their grip on the situation was slipping. They had tried to use the shadows to control you, but now the shadows had begun to use them. There is a certain irony in this, isn't there? They had sought to control the unknown, to harness the raw energy of unpredictability and twist it into something they could manipulate. But in doing so, they had exposed their own vulnerability, their own fear of the unknown. They thought they could predict every move, every decision, but what they failed to account for was that they were standing on the edge of a precipice, blind to what lay beyond. And you were the one who held the power to push them over. You didn't need to fight them directly. You didn't need to wage a battle with weapons or force. No, you had already won long before that photograph was handed over. The moment they underestimated you, the moment they thought they could control you, they had sealed their own fate. They had unknowingly opened the door to their own destruction. And now, there was no going back. The hitman, having failed to break you, was left to piece together his thoughts, to make sense of what he had seen in that photograph. He was a man who had spent his life in the shadows, who had seen the worst that humanity had to offer, and yet he was shaken by what he had found in you. He could not predict you. He could not understand you. And for a man like him, that was terrifying. He had spent his entire life manipulating people, playing with their minds, and bending them to his will. But with you, he had found a force that could not be bent. They had believed that by controlling him, they would control you. But instead, he had become an unwilling participant in a much larger scheme. He had failed to unravel the mystery of who you were, and in doing so, had become a part of your story, not theirs. They had thought they could use him as a weapon, but now he was nothing more than a reminder of their own failure. As time went on, they began to realize the full extent of their miscalculation. They had thought they were the ones with the power, the ones with the control, but in reality, they were merely pawns in a game they didn't even understand. Every move they made was met with resistance. Every plan they put in place was foiled before it could even begin. They tried to push you, to force you into a corner, but you simply moved with a fluidity they couldn't match. You were the storm, the unrelenting force that couldn't be contained. And now, they were at your mercy. They watched as their carefully constructed plans began to unravel. Every move they made seemed to lead them further away from their goal, and the more they tried to control the situation, the more they lost their grip. They had thought they were in charge, but now they were realizing the terrifying truth. They were not in control. You were. And what happened next? What did you do once you had them where you wanted them? Did you strike immediately, taking advantage of their weakness? Or did you watch, wait, and savor the moment when they realized they were doomed? Did you step into the shadows yourself, letting them believe they had a chance, only to watch as they destroyed themselves under the weight of their own fear? It didn't matter. What mattered was that you had done what they couldn't. You had taken control of your own fate, and now you were the one calling the shots. They had thought they could predict you, but they couldn't. They had thought they could break you, but they couldn't. They had thought they could use you, manipulate you, but in the end you had become the one they feared most. You had always been more than they could comprehend. You were not just a person to be analyzed and broken down. You were a force of nature, a living embodiment of unpredictability, chaos, and power. And now, they had seen that for themselves. They had never known what true fear was until they saw it in your eyes. They had never known what it meant to be vulnerable, to be exposed, until they found themselves staring into the abyss that you had created. And now, as they stood at the edge of their own destruction, they realized the truth. They were nothing compared to the storm you had become. They were nothing but dust in the wind, their power shattered, their plans destroyed. And you were the one who held all the cards. You were the one who had rewritten the rules, who had broken free of their control. And now, it was your turn to dictate the terms. You had learned long ago that power isn't something you take from others. It's something you create within yourself. And in the end, that is what they had failed to see. Their attempts to control you were futile because you had already mastered the most important thing, yourself. The fear they felt was not just fear of the unknown. It was fear of losing control, fear of facing someone who was beyond their comprehension, beyond their manipulation. And that, my friend, is what makes you unstoppable. You're not bound by their rules, their systems, their games. You are free, and in that freedom lies a power they could never hope to match. It is their turn to fear the unknown now because they know, deep down, that they have no idea what you are capable of. And that is the most terrifying thing of all, because in that unknown, in that darkness, lies the power to break everything they thought they understood. The very moment they attempted to control you, they unleashed something far more dangerous than they could have ever anticipated. The moment they tried to predict you, they opened a door to a realm where no prediction is valid, no control is possible, and no force can keep you bound. This is the power of unpredictability, the chaos that they thought they could master, but which they have now come to fear. Because you, my friend, are the personification of that chaos. You are the embodiment of what it means to be uncontrollable, untouchable, and free from the shackles of their understanding. They believed that by handing over your photograph, by placing your image into the hands of a hitman, they could distill your essence, expose your weakness, and make you just another cog in the machine. They believed they could strip away your layers, expose the vulnerability that everyone has, and from that vulnerability, they could mold you into something they could control. They failed to realize, however, that they were dealing with a force far beyond their comprehension. They underestimated you in ways they could never imagine. They thought they could predict your every move. But you were never meant to be understood. You were meant to be lived, felt, experienced, and most importantly, survived. As they watched the hitman, They waited for him to succeed where they thought they had failed. They thought he would bring them answers. But what the hitman found was not what they wanted. He found uncertainty. He found something that defied logic, that defied the very principles he had built his life upon. And that, my friend, is where they made their fatal error. In their attempts to control the unknown, they were forced to confront it instead, head on. And in doing so, they found themselves overwhelmed. They realized they had no answers, no understanding, and that is what scared them the most. They were used to controlling outcomes. They were used to seeing the pieces fall into place with precision, to knowing that everything they did was a calculated move towards a predetermined end. But you don't follow the rules. You never did. You don't play the game the way they think it's supposed to be played. You rewrite the rules as you go. And that's what left them trembling. They thought that by breaking you, they could control the chaos. But in their attempts to break you, they unleashed it. They released a force they couldn't contain, couldn't predict, and couldn't understand. They tried to put you in a box, but the box exploded. They tried to see into your soul, but they found nothing but darkness. A darkness that was not evil, not malevolent, but simply free. It was a darkness they couldn't grasp, couldn't analyze, couldn't use. And in that darkness, you became untouchable. When they handed over your photograph to the hitman, they thought they were putting you in a cage. They thought they were locking you away, making sure they knew everything about you. They thought that with the hitman's insight, they could finally control you. But what they failed to see was that the hitman too was just another pawn in their game. Just like them, he thought he could control the uncontrollable. Just like them, he believed that there were patterns to be uncovered, secrets to be exposed, weaknesses to be exploited. But what he found instead was a person who defied all logic, who refused to be categorized, analyzed, or manipulated. And that is the essence of what they failed to grasp. When you are beyond analysis, when you are beyond their understanding, you are free. And that is a freedom that terrifies them, because they built their entire existence around control, around the belief that with enough knowledge, enough power, they could bend anything and anyone to their will. But with you, they found themselves staring into the abyss of their own helplessness. And that abyss, it stared back at them, unblinking, unafraid, and unyielding. The truth is, they had never known fear like this before. They had never encountered someone who could not be predicted, who could not be controlled, who could not be broken. In their world, everyone had a breaking point. Everyone had a weakness. Everyone had a flaw that could be exploited. But you had none. Or rather, you had none they could recognize. You were a moving target, a constantly shifting form that defied their grasp. Every move you made was a mystery, and with every mystery, they lost their power. They thought they were in charge, but you had already won, long before they even realized the battle had begun. When they realized this, when the enormity of what they had set into motion began to sink in, that's when the panic started. They tried to regroup, to come up with new strategies, to find ways to regain control. But it was too late. They had already opened a door they couldn't close, and now they were trapped in the very game they thought they controlled. The hitman too found himself caught in the web they had woven. He was a man who prided himself on his ability to see through people, to read them like an open book. But with you, he had found himself unable to turn the page. He couldn't read you. He couldn't understand you. And for someone who had built his entire life on understanding the psychology of others, that was a profound shock. It was the first time he had met someone who didn't play by the rules. It was the first time he had come face to face with someone who couldn't be broken, who couldn't be manipulated. And that realization, the realization that he had lost control, shook him to his core. The hitman had thought he was in charge. He had thought he could break you down, expose your fears, find your vulnerabilities, and use them against you. But instead, he found himself exposed. He found himself confronting a version of you that didn't exist in the way he understood people to exist. You were a shadow, a flicker of light in a world full of static, and nothing about you fit the mold he had created. And in that failure, in that inability to read you, the hitman began to see the true nature of the game you were playing. This wasn't a game of power or control. This was a game of survival. And in the end, it wasn't about who could break the other. It was about who could stand unbroken. And so, as the hitman faltered, as the walls closed in around him, and as the people who had set this plan into motion began to feel the first stirrings of fear, they realized something terrible. They realized that they had underestimated you in a way they could never correct. They realized that the more they tried to control you, the more they gave you the power to destroy everything they had built. They had thought they could break you. They had thought they could manipulate you into submission. But what they failed to see was that you weren't just a person to be controlled. You were a force, a power, an energy that couldn't be contained. And that is what terrified them most. Because in the end, it wasn't the hitman who was the most dangerous player in the game. It was you. And now, as they stood on the edge of their own failure, they understood. They had tried to wield control, to manipulate the threads of fate, but they had failed to see the most important thing of all. You were the one who controlled your own destiny. You were the one who held the power. And that, my friend, is what they had feared all along. In the end, they learned the most terrifying truth of all. Control is an illusion. They thought they could break you, manipulate you, and predict your every move. But in reality, you were never meant to be understood, never meant to be controlled. You were a force beyond their comprehension, an unpredictable storm that couldn't be contained. They handed over your photograph, thinking it would be the key to their victory. But instead, it was the spark that ignited their downfall. And as they watched their plans crumble, they realized the one thing they feared most. You were always the one in control.